studios in New York City. This is Charlie Rose.
We begin this evening with the death of one of America's most beloved figures. Johnny Carson, the host of The Tonight Show, died on Sunday in Los Angeles at the age of 79. He was one of American television's most popular and most powerful stars. During his 30-year-long career as the king of late night, he promoted and bolstered the careers of new performers, among them Barbra Streisand, David Letterman, Woody Allen, Steve Martin, and Jay Leno. Virtually every figure of importance from film to politics and books and culture eventually wound up on his famous couch. Introduced by Groucho Marx on his first show in October of 1962, Carson went on to host more than 22,000 guests. He preferred to retire at the top of his game and did so in 1992. Joining me by phone now from Santa Ynez, California is Doc Severinsen, longtime band leader for The Tonight Show. Joining me from Washington, D.C. is Tom Shales, the television critic for The Washington Post. I am pleased to have both of them here. Tom, let me just begin with you. Tell me what made Johnny Carson great.
Well, his durability, his adaptability, his keen instincts for what an audience wanted, his innate charm, his absolute wonderful personality with which he ingratiated himself into, you know, the hearts and minds of 30 million people. It's a unique talent, and I don't know what you call it. I mean, it's talent, for one thing, but it isn't just that he was a great comedian. He was a great communicator and a person that people really felt extremely comfortable with, so much so that they were happy to have him in their bedrooms and laugh with him and look back at the day's activities.
It is said about him, and Doc, I'll get you to join me on this in just a second. It is said about him that part of the greatness of him was that he wanted the other guy to look good, whoever was on stage with him. Yet you said, Tom, what was great about the show is that we wanted to watch him.
Yeah, I don't think those two things are in conflict necessarily. I don't think he was sitting there thinking, oh, I'm the whole show, the spotlight's on me. I don't think he had that attitude at all. And bringing out the best in his guest was to his advantage, to the show's advantage, and of course it kept viewers happy and royally entertained. It was really amazing that that little show at 11:30 at night, and then eventually 11:35, often in their hour of largely improvised stuff, they could be more entertaining than anything that had preceded them in prime time that night, with all of its, you know, elaborate production and all of that. It just had a wonderful accessibility to everybody, and we were all happy to be part of that audience.
How did he do it, Doc?
Well, Johnny was an extremely bright man. He majored in logic in college, so he could take any side of an argument or a conversation and more than hold his own, and he could say to you, okay, which side of the argument do you want, and then just proceed to bury you. And he also could edit while he was talking. I mean, he would see the sentences that he wanted to say, and while he was saying them, he was editing just a bit ahead of what he was saying, which is, to me, pretty unique. But above all, I think the thing that really made it work for Johnny is he had such innate class. He just had class.
Expressed how?
Well, he was to his part of show business what Fred Astaire was to his part and what Cary Grant was to his part. He was that kind of an individual. He just had that style, and I don't know, I can't describe it any better than just saying he had real class.
Was he happy in retirement?
I think he was, yes.
I know Tom quotes Peter LaSalle as saying that he became, in retirement, even more fun to be around.
I would say that. I'll never forget the first time we went out to dinner after the show went off for us. We were joined by our two wives, And my wife and I walk into the restaurant, and I had on a pretty wild jacket. And I walked up to the table, and he says, "Oh, gee, that's a beautiful jacket." I said, "Cheap, you've lost it."
He never, Tom, was tempted, it appears, to come back. Someone told a story about that they wanted to do something on the night of the Oscars. Steve Martin did, and just have him come out and give a nod. And Carson thought about it and said it's a brilliant riff to do, but I've retired and I don't want to come back. Did you ever
Can you
talk?
imagine?
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, the place would have gone nuts. Can you imagine? I mean, it would have been the biggest thing on the show that night, probably. I don't know whoever won or whatever else, but we're not used to, in this country, people willingly stepping out of the spotlight. You know, everyone's trying to squeeze into it, and if somebody leaves an open space, someone else rushes in to get there, and they want to have their faces in every possible magazine and all of that. Even at the height of his activity, his popularity, Johnny was not the kind to be, you know, on the cover of People magazine, or he did not. He was not interested in any more exposure than he got every night as the official good night guy for the country.
Mm-hmm. The monologues meant what to the country, Tom?
Well, people have said it was a barometer of how political fortunes were going. You know, when Johnny started doing jokes about somebody, if they were derogatory jokes, making the guy look completely foolish, you could pretty well tell that he was on the way out as far as public favor was concerned. Peter LaSalle told me that sometimes Johnny would do a joke about, let's say, Dan Quayle, and the audience wouldn't respond much because they hadn't read enough, they hadn't heard enough about the guy yet to have an attitude. And Johnny would say to Peter, "Too soon, too soon. You know, I got to wait a little while on this guy until enough people know him." So it wasn't that Johnny made politicians famous. He had to wait until they achieved their own degree of, famousness, and then he could have a great influence, I think, over what the public thought of them, whether they were thought of as buffoons, lovable buffoons, or maybe not so lovable buffoons.
Tom, do you know whether he tried to influence his successor, that NBC chose Leno rather than Letterman?
He was never, I think this was a source of bitterness. He was never asked for his opinion, which seems incredible. I mean, you'd think they would at least do it for the sake of appearances, right. You know, that they would go to him and say, you know, who do you think should be, But they didn't care what he said. I mean, they had their charts and their numbers and their graphs and their demographics, that horrible word, demographics, and they gave it to Leno on that basis. And also, I think they felt, and I guess they were correct, that Leno would be a good boy, that he would behave himself, he wouldn't be trouble for the network, whereas Letterman thrives on kind of making the bosses mad. And I think Johnny stood up to the management of both the RCA and later GE, and of course those were the two owners of NBC while he was there. I always loved, he wasn't happy with the GE takeover, I don't think, at least not at first, and he always referred to it as the company with a heart, and very sarcastically. And he said, one year the Christmas card he got said, in lieu of a gift, we are firing a GE employee in your name. That was the Christmas card from General Electric.
You remember that, Doc?
I probably got it wrong.
Well, that's close enough.
Okay.
And yet, you know, he was good friends with Bob Wright.
Yeah, and still is, I understand.
Very close friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, how much influence did he have on the selection of the guest?
Well, I would say total. He had total control over everything.
Really?
And he knew everything that was going on all the time, and yet you never had the feeling that, gosh, I wish he'd leave me alone for 5 minutes.
If Johnny Carson was on the air tonight, was what he did be as popular as it ever was, Tom, in your judgment?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, would he? Are you saying he'd have all the competition that the
Well, yeah. I mean, in other words,
have?
sure.
you know, I think one reason he left is he saw that change coming in television, where the audience would be broken up into many parts, and that the competition would be so tremendous that there couldn't be any more one unifying guy. Like Ed Sullivan, you know, was on Sunday nights. Sunday nights belonged to Ed Sullivan, and late night belonged to Johnny Carson. But then others come in, and it gets crowded, and then somebody comes in. Arsenio Hall had a pretty good run opposite Johnny, appealing to a younger demographic, a younger audience. And I think Johnny was he did not want to read in the papers that his numbers were sliding, or that he was getting old, you know, looking old on the air, or any of that. I think he had a great abhorrence of coming across as someone who was, you know, hanging around past his prime. And as a result, he was absolutely in his prime when he left.
No one will ever forget that last night either, than Bette Midler, and his very human response to that. The other thing that was remarkable was the rapidity of the wit, the extraordinary rejoinder that he had. We all read about a lot of programs like this in which the guest comes on and it's all scripted. You had the impression with him that he could go anywhere and he could respond to anything. Doc?
That's absolutely right. He would follow the outline that he had, but if the guest opened it up with anything he might say or she might say, Johnny was paying attention. He was a great listener, and he would take that thing whichever way it needed to go. And I've seen other hosts that would come on to guest the show that you would think would know better, and they obviously didn't. They would ask the question and then not pay any attention at all to what the answer was. And Johnny was, he was the master of the whole thing. I mean, he knew what he was doing every minute.
Tom, you're right about the fact that what he was best at is when a joke went bad, and that he recognized that the audience loved that most.
Well, I think he loved it more when a joke
yes, exactly.
really hit. But yeah, second.
So as I said that, I realized how stupid it was.
No. But he was the master of the save. Milton Berle used to call it. Milton Berle would say, "Is this an audience or an oil painting?" You know, he would insult the audience as a way of making them laugh. But Johnny would deprecate himself. He would bring it all down on his head, and or sometimes he would plea for sympathy. When people would boo a joke, he would say, "You didn't boo me when I was, you know, up to here in the mud in Guadalcanal." You know, he would do these shameless appeals to patriotism and stuff. It was just, I just loved all those little rituals that he did, the many habits, and of course he developed a family. Much like they had on radio, and Doc was such an important part, and Ed McMahon, and this was a little extended family they had on that show, and there'd be guests who'd come in from time to time, like aunts or uncles, you know.
Yeah.
And the Mighty Carson Art Players, that was taken from Fred Allen's radio show, the Mighty Allen Art Players, and things like that. There was a continuity for Johnny with the great entertainment that he grew up himself listening to on the radio or seeing in the movies.
Yeah. It was a show built for late night, though, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I think brilliantly so, too. And everything about it just worked so well in that time period. And yet, we all looked forward to those annual, 2-hour primetime anniversary shows with the clips. And the clips that would appear every year, like the famous Ed Ames tomahawk throw. Yeah. Great stuff.
You saw that, and you saw some of that sort of range in terms of the choice of guests. People like Carl Sagan and some of the opera stars. They would come on at the back end of the program, but it also reflected his own sense of the, I thought, the depth of curiosity. Well,
he never ever used his superior intelligence in a way to show off. You know, he didn't walk the garden fence with it. I mean, he was careful how he handled that. But he used his mind to keep the show under control at all times.
When did you know the end was close, Doc?
Well, I I heard something about it a month or so ago, you know, and I guess I just didn't want to believe it. And in fact, a couple of days ago, I mentioned to my wife, I said, you know, I'm going to call Johnny and see if he wants to come up and see this new place of ours. And she says, I don't know, you might have waited too long. And then yesterday morning, about 7:15, we got a phone call from Jeff Sotzing saying that he had passed away. And I deeply regret that I, you know, didn't take the words that I heard to heart and get in touch or go see him.
Doc, I said this to you because someone said it to me today. You and I are friends, and I know you and saw you not long ago in New York, but someone said to me today, talk to Doc. He was a real friend of Johnny Carson. I never had the opportunity to meet him, but like everyone else, we look in the way Tom wrote about him, and this is how Tom Shells ends his piece. When he left, Johnny said he would like to relive all 30 years over again. If only we could. If only we could. Thank you, Doc Severinsen. Thank you, Tom Shells.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Back in a moment. Stay with us. Over the years, we have talked to many people on this program about Johnny Carson. What follows is some conversations that have been recorded on this program. They include Conan O'Brien, who will assume The Tonight Show in 5 years, David Letterman, who Carson was always in touch with and admired for his work, Bud Trillin, a writer who appeared more than 30 times on The Carson Show, and Bette Midler, who was there for the last program.
Nobody would ever tell you, go out every night with a blank slate and do an hour. I mean, it's a flawed premise, do you know? And yes, I know that there are writers and but still, no matter how much writing you have, you're still going out there and improvising the whole thing and trying to put a good face on it.
It also reminds you every night, too, how good Carson was.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, to do it as long as he did.
Yeah.
At the level he did it.
Yeah. Well, that's...
Doesn't it, or do you disagree?
No, I don't disagree. It's just one of those...
You're just hesitant about it.
It's one of those... Carson's this whole other category. And so when people invoke Carson, it's almost so obvious that I'm trying to think of, is there a new thing I can say?
I understand.
But
what
it's a tribute.
If he was in a whole category, what was it about Carson?
Well, it's a different time,
Right.
First of all, and I don't think we're going to see an entity like that again.
But as soon as you say it's a different time, how is it different? I mean, it seems to me he just did it extraordinarily well.
Yes.
And everybody who's on the air does it well, or you wouldn't be on the air.
Did it extraordinarily well. I think the thing that I appreciated most about Johnny Carson was his ability to talk to huge movie star, a person from the street, an old lady,
right.
And a little child, and someone who had written a bestseller,
Carl Sagan or someone like that, yeah.
A political leader. Today, it's so specialized that all of those, all those different skills have been broken down and separated into different shows almost. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I sometimes think that it's an impossible thing to say, but Carson today is competing with someone who's just interviewing people like Carl Sagan, or just interviewing little kids, or just interviewing movie stars. There's a lot of noise out there right now, and I think one of the things I appreciate so much about Johnny Carson, looking at him now, a few things. One is that he did all of those things so well. Two is that these shows have become hyperactive to a certain extent. One of my least favorite things in the world is energy for no purpose on television. That's 98% of television these days. Energy. Just turn on the TV late at night and watch it, or turn on any TV, any of these shows. People are standing, jumping, dancing.
I know. Well, I think about it when I'm sitting here having conversations, and just conversations.
Right.
I think something's going on 100 other channels that's full of energy and people jumping and talking, and it's full of improvisation and a lot of other things in which a whole school of writers have created.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here having a conversation.
Well, I think what's interesting is that Carson, I think, the show could be quiet, or he could listen. And he could make you really laugh by listening and just reacting with those great Jack Benny takes.
Here was a guy that understood his limitations and stayed within them and exploited that part of his personality to perfection. And I think that was the appeal of the man. Night in and night out, it was always going to be Johnny. Johnny, you could tell if Johnny would raise an eyebrow, oh, Johnny's upset. Johnny laugh, oh, Johnny's happy. But it was never much more than that, and he was very, very good at that.
What was the genius, though? I mean, what made him, he could do that night in, night out?
I think it was that part of his personality where he was, he never overplayed. He never tried to get out of what he was good at. And he was so comfortable, you never get tired of watching it. And, you know, you could watch him on Tuesday, he'd be the same on Friday. It was just like, oh, here's Johnny. Literally, here's Johnny. And he was something very comforting about that. And I think a cultural phenomenon. I can't imagine another single personality attaining that status now.
Is that why you so badly wanted to assume that mantle?
It was a pretty good job. It was a pretty good job. And when I was a kid, I remember watching The Tonight Show and thinking to myself, well, hell, I could do that. Yeah. Now, it's interesting that I would have that impression because I think that that's a testament to how easily he made it look, where a goofball kid like me would think, well, hell, I can do that. And for me, it's not as easy as it was for Johnny. But, you know, I did want it. I mean, it was a great job. And at the time, there were not many other jobs open. There were no other jobs open. So when I left my 12:30 show, there was nowhere else to go. So if I wanted to stay in broadcasting, which I did, doing the kind of thing I wanted, it had to be The Tonight Show.
And then you did Johnny.
Did the Johnny Carson show a couple of times, yeah.
And he instantly liked you.
Well, it went pretty well. It was no real surprise because I had about 4 or 5 years, and I had 20 minutes of material. 20 minutes of material, and I had it divided up roughly into 4 Tonight Show shots. And you've memorized it, every comma, every semicolon, every pause, everything. So it's rote. So I knew the first one would go pretty well, and it did go pretty well. And to me, that was, and I think is still the biggest thrill I've had since I've been doing television.
That night?
That night, yeah.
What did he say to you when you sat down?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I can remember at the time I was sitting there, and this happened. I left Indianapolis in 75, and I think like 78, 3 years later, I'm sitting next to Johnny Carson. You know, it wasn't Rich Little. You know, Johnny was there that night. It wasn't Hugh Downs filling in for Johnny. It was Johnny. And I can remember, and this is forgive me if it's clumsily articulated, but my reaction to it was like, all your life you see a $5 bill. All your life you see a $5 bill. And then suddenly you see Lincoln. It's like, oh my God, it's Honest Abe, the guy on the $5. And that was the reaction. And it was, you know, I was just completely wired for days and days and days after that. And still in all, that's was, I think, for me, the single most important, but also the single most thrilling experience of my life.
Do you miss Johnny Carson?
I do.
Because you were on a reasonable amount, weren't you?
Yeah, they counted up at the end. I think I was on, I don't know, 30 sometimes. I don't know. But I miss doing it because I sort of felt at home there, and I went back a couple times a year, and it was a very pleasant crowd. And I missed talking to him because he was so good at what he did. You know, the 5-minute or whatever it was, kind of show business, I mean, entertainment interview. He was brilliant at it, and he was funny, and it was just nice to watch him work.
I have such admiration for him, not only because of what you just said, but just the manner of his leaving and not looking back, and evidently being terrifically happy in retirement.
Yeah.
You don't hear stories about Johnny's unhappy, or Johnny lusts to be back, or Johnny anything. All you hear is, saw Johnny the other day, he's very happy, he's having fun.
And I think it was very consistent with the way he behaved throughout those years, which is, you know, as he left, as he changed his clothes or something, one of the producers would go up, or a couple of them, and sort of debrief him so he wouldn't have to come to the meeting about the next guest. We'd say, I don't want that guy anymore, or something like that. And then he kept sort of away from the show. He wouldn't have lasted that long without it. He was able to contain what he needed to contain.
Take me to this, because I want to show this, because I'm a huge, and you appreciate him more now than even when he was performing, Johnny Carson. Oh. That moment for you.
Which one? Oh, there were so many moments on that. The very last moment when I gave him the lay and ran off the stage, oh, it was too much. was all too much. The whole thing was too much, because they had called me, and I knew that if I actually sat down and thought about it, I wouldn't be able to do it, because I would be so frightened. So I put the enormity of it aside and just tried to be for him, to give him what I felt people would do for him if they were in the room. You know, I wanted to do for him what I really did believe that he was so loved, and he was so you know, they had such a good warm spot in their hearts for him. I wanted to honor him in some way, and so that all the concentration went on making sure that he got the message that how much we loved him. And it was great fun to do. Great fun. I'll never forget it. It's a great
moment in a career for you.
Yes.
It is. I mean,
yes.
it's a moment.
And it could have been so bad.
I mean, you were right in
tune.
The pitch happened to be perfect.
Yes, I think, and I'll tell you why I think so, because I put myself aside. I put my own self aside and my own interests aside, and only focused on what it was that he deserved. And that in life, that does work.
I'm just going to tell you. I mean, there's a lesson there.
In life,
I think
that does work.
Just sort of say, you know,
That's
quit worrying about how am I doing, how am I performing,
right.
and say, I'm going to give this moment.
That's right. That's right.
Roll tape. Here it is.
Here's Johnny.
After 30 legendary seasons, Johnny Carson was stepping down as host of The Tonight Show. And Johnny wanted Bet to be his final guest.
I still can't get over it. I still can't get over it, that out of all those people, he chose me. Unbelievable. I'm so agitated, and I'm so famished about this whole thing you're leaving.
22 years earlier, Johnny Carson had helped Bet launch her career. Now she helped Johnny say goodbye.
I can't believe it. The last guest, the last fool, Mr. Carson, will have to suffer gladly. You are the wind beneath my wings. Oh, well, he is. So thanks for the cheer. I hope you didn't mind me bending your ear. Make it one for my baby and one more.
God bless them. They really came forward with this great idea of that camera shot, watching Johnny Carson in an angle that you'd never seen. It was, you couldn't breathe. You just couldn't breathe.
And in all the weeks of emotional farewell shows, it was the one time that Johnny Carson was moved to tears.
It was wonderfully moving, and what you don't see on the show is that she finished the number and went and gave him this big lei that we had brought, and then went off because she burst into tears, which she didn't want to be seen doing. And he couldn't get her back out to take a bow, so he just kind of ended the show.
There's something to cry about.
Hmm?
There's something to cry about.
Yeah, it was very sweet. It was a wonderful, wonderful evening. I'll never forget it.
You were in tears and you had to run off.
Yeah. Well, it was so many years, you know. So much. He helped me so much.
How so?
You know, well, he gave me a shot.
Yeah.
And he was the biggest thing on TV, and to get onto that show was such a big deal. And he cared for me. I was like, you know, a little mascot. He looked after me, and he you know, asked how I was doing. He, you know, watched me, and he was very proud of me, I think. He was very proud, and it was wonderful, wonderful.
People have said about him to me is they knew they had to perform, and they knew it had to be good, but they also knew that he would do everything he could to protect them and make them look good.
Yes.
That he was there for you because he wanted to help you be as good as you could for his show.
That's absolutely the truth. Absolutely the truth. But the focus was quite intense. I mean, you really did feel that this was conscious. This wasn't anything that he ever forgot. He really, literally did want you to look good. Because when you look good, he looked good. And his whole crew looked good. Because they had found people who no one knew and had brought them along to a point where the whole world would say, that person's great.
it's easy to say there's no one like him today, but it's different even today, isn't it? Beyond the fact there's no one like him, it's different.
Yes, it's very different. A lot of the, for instance, I think that if he had been around during this Bill Clinton thing, I don't think he would have made those jokes. I really don't. I really don't. I mean, we've had 6 years of, you know, chipping away at the image of the president, and there was, I mean, he teased, but he was never as vicious as what has been going on for the last 6 years, and he was just too classy a guy. He was just too classy.
And you
there was a level beneath which he would never stoop, and I think that's fabulous. But those days are long gone.
To our detriment.
I think so. I think so because everything is so coarse. I mean, it used to be that there was Belle Barth, you know, there was Frances Faye, there was Lenny Bruce, who was brilliant. Besides being coarse, he was brilliant. And there was a reflection of a certain arena of society that was not, you know, it was almost like it was show business. People were like that in show business, but people weren't like that in the world. People paid money to see people act out like that. Now everybody's acting out like that. And there's no differentiation between what you see on the stage and what you see in real life. And I don't know, in a funny way, I kind of miss the dignity.
Yeah, there's a coarseness.
And there's nothing to bang against now. You know, I mean, who am I to say it's so coarse? I was the queen, you know.
Yes, you were.
But in a way,
yeah,
but there wasn't all these other there weren't all these other coarse people in my path. Now even I can't even be coarse. Can't fun it.
It's no more fun to be coarse.
That's right.
Because there are too many people trying to be course.
Exactly. It's no more fun.
But coarse is not what you were. You were sassy.
I was sassy. Well, thank you, dear.
No, but that's it, don't you think? I mean, or tell me, understand
well,
what it was the magic
sass.
of...
It was sass because it was very wholesome. It was not frightening. It wasn't terrifying. You didn't think you never thought I was going to leap off and spit in your eye or anything.
No, I expected you to say the smartest, sassiest sort of...
Yeah, it was sassy is very good.
Wink at me and say, you got it, baby.
Sassy's good. Sassy's good.
Johnny Carson, dead at age 79. If you do a nightly television show, a late-night show, regardless of its nature, you have nothing but profound admiration and the recognition that no one has or probably ever will do it as good as he did it. Tonight, our best wishes for his family. Back in a moment as our show continues. Jared Diamond is here. He teaches geography at the University of California, Los Angeles. That's UCLA. In 1998, Diamond won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. It explored how modern societies evolved. He has recently published a companion to the bestseller. It is called Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. I am pleased to have him at this table for the first time. Tell me what it is you think. I mean, your book that won the Pulitzer Prize, Guns, Germs, and Steel, was one of the most successful science books in a long time. What does it say, other than your own talents as a writer and as about the public appetite to understand who we are and where we're going and what could happen to us?
In the case of Guns, Germs, and Steel, I think the reason that the public was turned on by it was that the book deals with perhaps the most obvious question about human history, why history unfolded differently for different peoples, why it is that Europeans conquered the New World instead of Native Americans conquering Europe, why Europeans brought slaves to the New World. And all of us are interested in these questions.
These are big questions.
They're big questions, and they're not answered by historians because they prove to be unexpectedly difficult. But we see the results, and we wonder what's the reason. Since we're not told the answer by historians, We suspect that maybe it has something to do with people's brains, because we can see that people have different faces. Maybe behind the different faces are different brains, although there's no evidence for it. But the book discusses what I think are the real reasons, the environmental reasons why European...
You mean this book?
No, the previous book, Guns,
book.
Germs,
Okay,
and
because I
Steel.
know this is about how environment determines collapse, but go ahead.
Right. The previous book discussed environmental factors, particularly the availability of domesticable plants and animals. It happened that the Fertile Crescent of Western Asia was where the wild ancestors of what are still the most valuable crops and animals in the world live. That's where people domesticated cows and sheep and goats and wheat and peas. So people there got a head start on agriculture, which means they got a head start on metal tools and writings and states, and they and their descendants in Europe went on to conquer the world.
And now you turn to collapse.
The flip side of rises.
Was that an automatic decision by you? That I've looked at the evolution, I might as well look at the collapse?
No, it was really a different decision. I was interested in collapses of societies because ever since I was a teenager, I've been fascinated by photographs of Maya cities in the jungle. Why on earth did they build cities in the jungle, and then why did they abandon them? And I think most of us get interested in stories like the Maya and Easter Island. So it arose out of this romantic interest. And then I realized that there were bigger questions involved. Why did some societies fail while others succeeded? Japan has gone on 14,000 years without a collapse. And then today there are societies collapsing and at risk of collapsing. So what can we learn from...
Now, what's the best example of a society at risk of collapsing?
There are several dozen best examples.
Okay, give me...
Among them.
The top three.
Among them. Haiti, Solomon Islands, Somalia has already collapsed, Nepal, Afghanistan already.
What do you mean by society, then? You don't mean a nation state, by definition. You mean something else.
Yeah, but I would define collapse to be a drastic decrease in human numbers or in political, social, economic complexity over a large area.
So what does that mean for Afghanistan and Haiti and Somalia, that they're heading towards non-existence?
No, they're not. They're certainly not heading towards non-existence. In the case of Somalia and Haiti, it's not a population collapse. In the case of Somalia, there's already been a collapse of organized government.
Right.
In Haiti, there's been a virtual collapse of government and a descent into worse and worse poverty.
Let me go back to the Mayans, only because that intrigues me. Why did they do it in the jungle, and why did they leave it?
Okay. They did it in the jungle because it turns out that the Yucatan Peninsula is a good place to build up a civilization if you're farmers. The Maya developed the most advanced society in the New World before Columbus. They had writing, they had wonderful astronomy, great art and monuments, and there were lots of them. There may have been as many as 50 million Mayas. They built up a civilization that rose steeply in numbers until about AD 800, and then it rather swiftly collapsed within about a century. So the kings were overthrown. Maybe as many as 90% of Maya people died off. They abandoned the cities, and there's been this long-standing mystery.
Well, but the other question, too, is how come they were so remarkable in terms of the cities they built?
Well, they were remarkable because, again, environmental reasons. The Maya were part of Mexico, and Mexico is where corn was domesticated. This is the Fertile Crescent of the New World. Mexico produced corn and squash and beans, so that Mexico was it's the only place in the New World where writing developed. It's the only place where the wheel was invented, and the Maya participated in all those developments.
Here's what the Financial Times has a piece about you, big piece about you, called "What on Earth Were They Thinking?" And it basically says, "Collapse, your book, deepens Diamond's environmentalist arguments substantially, looking in detail at a range of societies that have collapsed as they exhausted their environments. What Diamond's students asked him was going through the minds of the East Islander. What your students said to you was going through the minds of the East Islanders as he chopped down the island's last tree." Collapse sets out to answer that question by looking at the ways of thinking that lead societies to destroy themselves. Why did they do it?
That's an intriguing question.
That's a book.
It's the book. It's, in particular, chapter 14 of the book. My UCLA students were my guinea pigs as I worked out the book for the past 3 years. And my students recognized the importance of this question that I had missed. Why on earth would a society do things that ends up destroying the society? For example, Easter Island Society, those Polynesians 2,000 miles off the coast of Chile who erected the giant stone statues, ended up completely deforesting their island. And when they did that, their agricultural productivity dropped. They could no longer transport and erect statues. They didn't have canoes to go fishing. So why on earth were they so dumb as to chop down all their trees? But of course, it's more complicated. They weren't dumb. They were making decisions that seemed in their best interests at the time. They were trapped with competition between chiefs who focused on the Easter Island equivalent of winning the next election. If you didn't erect a bigger statue, you were out of a job as a chief.
Can you now argue that people who are knowingly cutting down rainforests are destroying their society?
Yes, indeed. In fact, the Solomon Islands, one of those places that I mentioned as already having had state failure recently, the Solomon Islands have cut down most of their accessible rainforest to get money in the short run, but it's also the rainforest of the Solomon Islands that provides fertility of soil and sources for housing.
Okay, but do they think that they are destroying themselves when they do it, or are they just simply saying, you know, I can't comprehend tomorrow, I can only think about today?
Sometimes that's the case. There are different reasons why people make these disastrous decisions. In some cases, it's short term. They need money to provide schooling and clothes for their children, even though they know that it'll get them in trouble in the long run. In other cases, it's a conflict of interest. The local people don't want to do it, but the government does because it's bribed or corrupt or will get money, and the government may in fact send in police when the local people try to interfere with the logging. Those are a couple of the reasons.
When you look at this whole notion of cultural values to a society's collapse, what do you find out about that?
Well, cultural value, I would say that one of the two deepest lessons of my book has to do with the role of cultural values. Societies that get in trouble often do so when cultural values that served them well in the past and have been the source of their strength are now no longer appropriate to the changed conditions. So, for example, the Greenland Norse, these were Norwegians who went out and settled Greenland around AD 1000. They built up a European Christian society with writing. They thrived in this difficult environment for nearly 500 years. And it was their identity as Europeans that let them preserve their sanity and cooperate so far from Europe. But it was also their identity as Europeans that finally killed them, because when the Inuit, the Eskimos, came into Greenland, the Norse despised the Inuit as pagans. They refused to learn from them. They immediately began stabbing the Inuit. And so the Norse in Greenland starved to death amidst an abundance of fish and seals that the Inuit were capturing and the Norse were not. So the Christian values did them in.
What's your prophecy for the United States?
The United States has two painful reappraisals of values ahead of us regarding our consumerism and regarding our isolationism. As far as isolation is concerned, the United States has been separated by the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean from any nation strong enough to threaten us. And so George Washington, in his farewell address, warned us against entangling alliances. After World War I, we then retreated into isolationism. But today, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean no longer are barriers. Things that happen even in Somalia and Afghanistan affect the United States. So we need to make our own painful reappraisal of getting engaged with the rest of the world on a chronic basis, not just by sending in 150,000 troops and spending $100 billion.
This would be Iraq.
Iraq or Afghanistan.
Right.
We can't, there are 24 countries out there waiting to be the next Iraq and Afghanistan. We can't afford that money each time. We have to do something towards being chronically engaged on long-term problems, the problems that make a country like Iraq or Afghanistan blow up.
So we have to come to some kind of test so that we determine, you know, how we get involved and where we get involved and when we get involved and how much we get involved.
I would say a simple answer is that we have to be involved not on a short-term basis in crisis solving, but we have to be involved on a long-term basis dealing with the underlying problems, which are especially problems of public health, and problems of the environment. These are the foremost long-term problems that keep countries poor.
And how do we do in those two tests, public health and environment?
Not nearly as well as we could be doing. I would add a third, family planning, population, because population is another underlying threat to many countries whose population is soaring. We could take public health as an example, and this just illustrates the feasibility of these long-term solutions. The three leading infectious diseases in the world today are malaria, TB, drug-resistant TB, and AIDS.
Right.
And it's estimated that a worldwide program to get a start on dealing with these three diseases around the world would cost about $25 billion.
That's easy.
It's a few months of Iraq.
Sure.
But doing this would start to address fundamental problems around the whole world and would reduce the risk that we would then have to throw lots of money on short-term military interventions.
So we ought to be doing that as a matter of public policy and our own survival.
Exactly. We should be doing it as a matter of our own survival, whether or not, yes, it's important for the suffering people out there, but this has now become a matter of national survival.
Which is the reason that people in certain administrations, and I think even the Bush administration has said this in so many words too, is that the environment and HIV/AIDS are national security issues.
That's exactly right. The third thing that I would add, the environment, AIDS and malaria and TB are national security issues. And then the third national security issue is population growth. In some countries, population growth is still more than 3% per year. And when you've got a poor country that is producing masses of children, the ratio of working adults to children is low. The people in those countries know this perfectly well, and they would like to reduce their rate of population growth. They need support. They need the technologies. They need the condoms and other devices from the Western world.
What are the Chinese, how would you characterize what they're doing?
The Chinese found a drastic solution to halting their rate of population growth. Many people would...
One child.
Namely the one-child policy. Right. But it doesn't take such a drastic solution. For example, Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia has already reduced its population growth rate to less than 2.5% per year, maybe 2% per year, not in a conspicuous way. Americans could be helpful in providing family planning and family planning support to Indonesia, where there's not resistance to family planning. What's just needed is money and support to back it.
Money and support from the United States or some other international combination of nations like the G7 or something like that?
From anywhere, but the United States is the richest country on earth. It's in our interest, and we're the most capable of providing that.
You would be, if George Bush would have you in and say, Professor Diamond, I understand you wrote a great book and won a Pulitzer Prize, and you know something about who survived and why. You would say to him, Mr. President, spend more money internationally on issues where you can make a considerable difference, because in the long run, it will come back to pay dividends to you and our country.
I would say that, and then the second half of the sentence would be that if you do that, then you won't have to invest troops and money every time each one of these dozens of countries
So
explodes.
let's take Iraq. What should we have done to affect change in Iraq?
Well...
So that they didn't spend $100 billion.
Well, yeah. In Iraq...
I have drug you into politics.
Yeah, fair enough. Iraq has underlying environmental problems, and they're of long standing. Iraq began to deforest itself already 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Iraq was the center of world agriculture 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. Iraq has had problems of salinization, salt destroying what were original farmlands. It's been going on for a long time. What we could have done about Iraq 15 or 20 years ago, that's late in the game. I would have said more hopeful would be preventing other countries such as Nepal, the Philippines, Indonesia from going the way of Iraq.
We can do that now.
That we can do now. Nepal already has an insurgency. The Philippines already have an insurgency. The Philippines are massively deforested. Indonesia is in the process of deforestation. We could provide underlying public health, environmental, and family planning support to those countries and others.
Where do you think the United States will be 20 years from now?
that is up for grabs. That depends upon what the American people will do. People often ask me, Jared, are you an optimist or pessimist? And my answer is, it depends upon our choices. Where the American people are 20 years from now depends upon the choices that we're making today. The leading problems that the world faces now are problems of our own making. I'm not worried about an asteroid crashing into us. I am worried about population, toxic chemicals, invasive species, soil, water, etc. But they're all problems that we cause, and therefore since we cause them, we could choose to stop causing them. We could begin to stop causing them tomorrow. And if we did that, in 20 years from now, my 17-year-old sons at age 37 will be in a world worth living in. And if we don't address those problems, then in 20 years from now, they'll be in a world worse than the world today.
There are those who argue with you, have some that you don't appreciate technology sufficiently. Technology has given us, it's been the engine of our economy. It's given us a whole range of things that benefit the society. And in concert, hand in hand with biotechnology and biomedicine, it has enabled us to find new solutions to all the issues that you talk about in terms of immunization and everything else.
Sure. It's often said
it's a real hope of the future.
That technology will solve our problems, and it's the hope of the future. One often hears that, and there are three things wrong with that.
And societies that appreciate that will rise. Societies that lose that momentum will find themselves in second place.
It's surely wrong, and there's a lot more than technology required to solve our problems. Technology will make some limited contributions. For example, windmills are now much better than they used to be, and they can contribute to sustainable energy. The three problems are that technology itself is both constructive and destructive. The reason that we face difficult problems today is the consequences of technology, such as motor vehicles, pollution, dependence on oil, etc. Point number one. Point number two, new technologies regularly have unanticipated side effects, including bad side effects. For example, since I grew up in the 1940s, I remember in the 1940s that when you went to sleep at night, you worried that your refrigerator might develop a leak because refrigerant gases then were poisonous things like ammonia. Right. And there was this great technological solution, the CFCs or freons. Unfortunately, and they were non-toxic. Unfortunately, it turned out, and took quite a while to find it out, that under the conditions of the upper atmosphere, they break down into substances that destroy the ozone layer. So there's an example of how technology regularly has unanticipated side consequences.
Are you in the end optimistic about America or not?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm not pessimistic, otherwise I would have committed suicide on the way into here today, and my wife and I wouldn't have had children. I'm not wildly optimistic because I recognize we got problems, we got to address them. But if we address our problems, then the problems are soluble. And what I don't know is whether we'll choose to address them.
That's political will in part, is it not?
Political will, and that's why I wrote the book.
And political leadership, which gets a citizenry, makes the argument too.
Ultimately the leadership, but the leadership depends upon us, the voters, right, and us in our choices as consumers.
Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. Jared Diamond, author of Guns and Germs and Steel, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
Thank you.